explore Fantasy Grounds at its core. So essentially, Fantasy Grounds, most rule sets are based on the core RPG. Anything that has to do with common functionality in Fantasy Grounds will be descripted in the area under the basic guide. So essentially, this kind of goes over what can be done on a base level with Fantasy Grounds. Where the variation starts is when you start introducing rule sets. And generally, all that is character creation is one of the biggest differences in most rule sets, and then how the actual interface um, kind of meshes with the rule set. That's really the main differences. And then, of course, the titles and stuff will be a little bit different in the interface. But generally speaking, if you want to know about just Fantasy Grounds itself, especially if you're going to develop content or if you're a GM who plays in multiple rule sets, it's good to have an idea and understanding of what is similar or common amongst Fantasy Grounds. I think some of us get too wrapped up in the differences, and we don't really look at the bigger picture. And I'm guilty of this as well. When I first started, I just looked at D&D 5e pretty much, and then any other rule set was foreign to me. But as I've matured in my understanding of the platform, I realized that there's more differences than there are in just the character creation, but there's more similarities than there are differences. So character creation is probably the biggest difference, but most of the rule sets, I'd say 90% of them are similar. So they just are, depending on how they're developed and how they translate into Fantasy Grounds, is also this little nuanced differences. You'll notice that some rule sets get a lot more support because of popularity and that sort of thing. And then also you'll notice that not every rule set needs all that automation and such. And then the other thing that you might want to consider is that some people just want to play a really basic game with just rolling dice and maybe showing some maps. So the core RPG is good for that. So if you want to use your Fantasy Grounds around a table and you just want to share images and roll dice, that's a perfect way to do it. The other thing to keep in mind is that Fantasy Grounds is an evolving piece of software. It's not set in stone. So if you're looking at features 6 months ago, they might be out of date already. So that's kind of good that you got some forward progress. But for us old grognards you've been using it for a while, sometimes those changes can be rather annoying and surprising because we didn't know that those changes were coming or we didn't pay attention to the release updates. But nonetheless, there are more similarities than there are differences. And the differences are, like I said, character creation, some variations of how the interface is titled, and then the actual how the rule set actually interfaces with Fantasy Grounds. That's about the only differences, really. And then the level of support. If you guys remember, we went through a pretty big move by Smiteworks earlier this year, a few months ago. They were updating and standardizing the interface and some of the functionality of Fantasy Grounds, and that's to keep everything kind of more copacetic and trying to keep everything kind of in line. Because before you had kind of different things going on with rule sets, and they were developed and differently each time. And I think they needed to have some sort of starting point in order to make this smoother. So generally speaking, Fantasy Grounds functions the same throughout most rule sets. So you're going to have this campaign set up whenever you first start. You're going to have this graphic. You have the chat window. You have your combat tracker. And then you have your party sheet. These are your main components of most of the rule sets. I think 99% of them have this. Once you understand the nuances of this, meaning all of these different pieces of Fantasy Grounds, you can almost get into any rule set and kind of have an idea where things are at. You're not going to know everything, but if you went from like D&D to Pathfinder, I don't think there'd be a huge change in Fantasy Grounds. It'd be more or less rules and character creation. So those are the differences that you might notice straight away, is just how the game plays. and how it interfaces with the rule set. But generally speaking, all these things in Fantasy Grounds are the same. They may look a little different, or they might be titled differently. So there might be, instead of encounters, they might call it something else, or instead of NPCs, it might be called threats, or whatever the rule set determines. But you'll notice that there are much more similarities than you would realize. And I think people kind of get too hyper focused on the fact that the rule set is different, but they don't look at how Fantasy Grounds is the same across 99% of the rules. So one of the things that I think Fantasy Grounds does well is it helps you organize and it keeps track of your combat pretty well. And it also gives you a way to award your group. So this party sheet here is something that is fairly functional across all the rule sets. So this would be where you would track your character's wealth, experience points, and inventory. The combat tracker obviously does your initiative, attacks, damage, saves, effects, those sort of things. And the map tools is pretty much the same across the board. So you might have a little bit different assets, but mostly it's the same. There aren't much differences in the map tools. So when you're using Fantasy Grounds in whatever rule set, that part of it is the same. There isn't a whole lot of difference there other than the content that you're working with, whether it be art, tokens, or maps. So that may vary, but the actual functionality of it doesn't vary much at all. The dice pretty much work the same in most rule sets. They're going to have variations, obviously, but that is basically how Fantasy Grounds interfaces with a given rule set. So I think the main differences, and I'm going to say this again, is character creation and how the rule set is adapted to Fantasy Grounds. Other than that, all this other stuff is the same. So whether it looks like this or not in your game won't really make that much of a difference. I think we get kind of caught up in the idea that, it doesn't look the same, so it's not the same. It really is. 99% of this stuff is really the same. You can still make shortcuts in any rule set. So if I wanted to, let's go into books. Don't have any loaded, so we'll go to modules and go to activation. This part is the same. I mean, it's very similar. So I'm just going to I'm going to load this map bundle and then maybe one of these other, because I'm in the core rule set. This is core. So this doesn't have a whole lot to it, but here's the calendar system, which is going to be available in most rule sets. And then you got all of these other multifunctional things like map packs. Most of those work in all the different rule sets. So that's the real beauty of Fantasy Grounds. Is actually more alike than it is different. And I think that we are kind of missing the mark here on how we look at this and how we perceive the platform overall. So when you're using Fantasy Grounds, the functionality, like the right clicking, in this case, if you bring up these maps and images, that's going to be the same regardless of what rule set you have. Now, the distance between the squares might be in meters instead of feet, or you might have different movement, but essentially the map functionality is going to be the same. So there isn't a whole lot of difference there when it comes to this sort of thing in Fantasy Grounds. And, if you want to bookmark something, if you left click and drag this down to the hotkeys, that's going to be the same regardless of what rule set you're in. So there are functions that you'll learn with Fantasy Grounds regardless of the rule set that are going to be similar. And like I said, the only real difference over here on the right, I believe, is what these things over here are called. So they may have different names for them, but they're essentially the same thing. A couple of the rule sets might have less or more options depending on the complexity of it. But generally speaking, I mean, this part up here, the options, that varies a little bit from rule set to rule set. So these are all of the gameplay options and the Fantasy Grounds settings. So When you load a rule set, you're going to have more options or less depending on which rule set you have. But some of the universal things are, for instance, desktop restore Windows on start. That is going to be pretty much universal. The other thing I like to turn off as a game master is this auto center map. So what that'll do is prevent Fantasy Grounds from moving the map around when you have your map set up and centered. If you have that on and you go to advance the combat tracker, you kind of lose your spot and it moves around on you. So I usually turn that off. But that's going to be the same in most rule sets. The sound pretty much is going to be the same. Now, it may not be supported in the rule set, but the interface is going to be similar. The chat show GM roles, that's going to be the same. Dice Tower, if there is one in your game, that's going to be the same. You turn it on, move it, whatever you want to do. Coloring the dice is going to be the same. I mean, there's so many things that are alike that it isn't even funny. It's kind of crazy that we think that Pathfinder is so different from D&D. Yeah, it's different in the actual rules and character creation, but in Fantasy Grounds it's very similar. So on the Atlassian guide, when you go to these basic guides, this talks about those similarities. It talks about working with image, how to use a chat window, the sound links, token locking, player and NPC token vision on maps. All this stuff is going to have a commonality between rule sets. And then also managing the data for your campaign. That's all going to be very similar. So there isn't a whole lot of difference other than the character creation and some of the dice rolls and stuff, but a lot of it's similar. Let's see, this diagonal distance, that's kind of similar through all the games. I usually put it on 1.5. Token scale is going to be the same. Party vision and movement is going to be the same. So a lot of this stuff, the functionality is common amongst most rule sets. So it will help once you understand that and you change your perception of the platform itself and you just kind of learn the base of it. Once you do that, it just kind of clicks. You start getting it. Like you'll start learning that you can link things together. You can do something like this in any rule set. So I would take some notes here and create like my own campaign notes. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but essentially this is going to be my campaign notes to organize my sessions. And I'll link things to this that I'm going to use in my next session. So for instance, in these battle maps, I might want to use these first couple caves. So I'm going to link those here. And that way I don't have to go looking for those during the game. Let's say this map bundle, we got this nice little reference manual. And let's take a look at some of these maps, see what they give us here. Okay, it's loading. It's got a lot of maps in it. Yeah, so this is just a bunch of maps that are included in this, but you might want to pop this out. Maybe you want to use this map. So it can be a map, it can be a link to anything, and you'll have this functionality across the board with like 99% of the rule sets. Let's say this calendar function is very similar. So I'm going to go to activation for this calendar, and you come up here to the calendar area, and you can pick which calendar you want. I'll just use the Gregorian calendar, which is a standard calendar, and that's going to be the same in all the rule sets. So there are some similarities, or a lot actually of similarities, that you'll probably miss, especially if you only play one rule set. You'll kind of be narrow in scope, but once you learn that one rule set, it's almost the same across the board. So if you have to make a switch from Pathfinder to D&D, or maybe you're tired of second edition and you want to play Shadow Dark, or whatever it is, it's going to be very similar. And the sooner you understand that as a GM and as a developer, the easier it gets for you. And there is a lot of base functionality in Fantasy Grounds that's already there. And you don't really have to reinvent the wheel very often. And technically, a lot of the extensions are quality of life, or they will fill in a gap where there's a functionality that someone wants or needs, or is annoyed with, and they want it to happen automatically. But generally speaking, this platform is very similar across the board. It is something that it just takes a couple sessions, and once you teach your players how to build characters, it gets a lot easier. And that's probably my biggest suggestion and advice, is to learn how to build characters, because that's probably the half the game right there. The other half is learning this interface, and it's not too bad once you start digging into it. The difficulty is when you start focusing on all the little nuances and the differences, and you start stacking on a whole bunch of modules and things like that. And the optimization for memory is the same through most of these rule sets. So, if you got a huge map, you're probably going to have problems, in regardless of what rule set you have. Or if you got 20 books loaded, and you got a whole bunch of tokens shared, and you've got this combat tracker loaded with like 20 different NPCs, that stuff is going to impact Fantasy Grounds regardless of the rule set. There are physical limitations, and there will be things that you'll come up against when you're running content on Fantasy Grounds. The signing into Fantasy Grounds, setting up a campaign, all that stuff's the same too. So there really isn't a whole lot that's different, other than character creation and how the dice work, and then maybe some of the labels over here on the right, and then of course how the interface ties in or meshes with the rule set. And that's what takes the time. That's where the rubber meets the road, is when you learn how the rule set interfaces with Fantasy Grounds. That's when you really start learning the rules, and not so much Fantasy Grounds, but you start learning how to use it with the rule set. So that takes time. You're not going to learn that overnight. That's something that everyone has to go through, and I don't think it's any different on any other rule set or platform for that matter, because you're going to still have to learn how to use the rules. And that there is no manual for that. That all comes with time and experience, and knowing what you want and knowing what you don't want. And one other caveat that I wanted to mention, some of you may or may not agree with this, but in the case of Fantasy Grounds, it does a really good job organizing for campaigns. However, if you don't organize at all, and you try to run everything just willy-nilly without any prep at all, I think that makes it a little bit more challenging. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying that it is can be problematic until you get intimately familiar with the interface and your content. So if you want to use a map and you don't know which one you want, but you don't know where they're at, that's going to take time to go through this interface and find them. So this is why I linked them to this area here. So I might use one of these three maps during my game. And I've already done the research, and I've already put it where I want it to go. So in this case, and this is also true of any Fantasy Grounds session, is once you move the images where you want them to go, they'll stay. So this is something I always bring up during my sessions. So you might have this map up here, and that's where you want it to appear every time you log in. And this is where you're going to play from. And then you might put a link down here so you can get to it easier. But once you move the window and resize it, it'll stay there. And that's important to know that. So if you close this and you go to reopen it, it's going to go where you left it. That functionality is common in all the rule sets. Same thing with this campaign. Once I close this, if I open this back up, my notes here, it's going to open up where I left it. So that's a very common thing in Fantasy Grounds. Now, if you open up something you've never opened before, it's going to go in the middle. And that's a starting point. Once you move the window to where you want it to go and then you close it, it is no longer going to be in the middle. It's going to be where you left it. So that's a function of Fantasy Grounds. And once you understand that, it gets a little less frustrating moving windows around and managing your window. So that's another thing that you'll learn over time. It's because what ends up happening a lot of times is I've seen people go through their content, and I did the same thing, and they'll go, oh, okay, here's this book with this image, and then they got like this page here, and they've got like this open here, they've got this over here. So what ends up, you just got this big mess. It's really hard to manage the game. And you're moving windows around and you're doing all this other stuff to get to your content. And that's why I recommend like making like a little crib sheet here so you can get to your content quicker if you have the time to do it. There are occasions where you're just going to have to wing it. You don't always know what you're going to need when you need it, but majority of the time, if you go through your content before you play and link them to at least down here at the bottom or into your own little list, it'll make it so much easier for you to get to your content, and you're not fighting the interface as much. And also, you can take and put these windows where you want them to show up the next time. So when you start playing again, they'll all be where you left them, and that's where you're going to expect them to be when you come back. So that's a really important aspect of Fantasy Grounds. It's one of the ways that you can organize and manage your windows. So that's some functionality. That's a very core function of Fantasy Grounds. And I think that once you understand that, it gets a lot easier. Uh, I'm not saying that everything's going to be a cakewalk, but I mean, once you understand what the limitations and the capabilities of the platform are, it gets a lot easier, and it gets to be, I wouldn't say funner necessarily, but yeah, it's entertaining because you can really set up a really nice session. And I think Fantasy Grounds is a tool for organizing sessions, not so much running it off the seat of your pants. It makes it very difficult. And I think that the way the system's set up now is difficult to do that. And I don't know if there's a good way to do it or not. I've tried it where I just roll like on a random table and I pop up some monsters and I'll throw them in an encounter and such during gameplay, but it really does slow things down. It's a lot nicer if you have the luxury of setting that up before. But essentially, that's all I wanted to kind of cover is that Fantasy Grounds at its core really is the same. It 99% of it is the same. The only difference is, like I said, character creation, and that's probably half the game right there. Once you learn how to build characters and you know how to adjust them and level up and customize those, it gets so much easier because you're not fighting as much. And once your players get used to their character sheets, it's pretty simple. After a couple sessions, they'll be like pros. So anyhow, folks, you guys have a good weekend, and I'll see you around. And if you guys are around tomorrow night, we're going to have a special last episode of All Things Fantasy Grounds for Rob Tui, and that'll happen tomorrow night at 6 on his Twitch channel, 6 p.m. Pacific time or 9 Eastern. So you guys take care, and I hope this helps a little bit. I know I didn't really get too deep into all the different little functions, but I just wanted you to be aware that there are more similarities than differences.